Good afternoon and welcome to today's industry-presented webinar, Secrets to Enhancing Shoulder Strength and Function. A few housekeeping things before we get started. This is a voice-over IP webinar, meaning it's totally web-based. If you experience audio difficulties or if the video begins to buffer, it's likely caused by the strength of your internet signal. If you are having issues, try logging off and logging back on. If you have a question during the webinar, please type it into the question area within the GoToWebinar navigation, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the presentation. If your question goes unanswered, we'll take additional questions from today's webinar and post answers as a blog on the ACSM website at a later date. We also encourage you to join the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter by using the hashtag ACSMwebinar. Today's webinar is presented by Functional Movement Systems Incorporated. Functional Movement Systems is an education company that produces and promotes principles and methodologies to enhance movement as individuals engage in physical activity. They are committed to giving fitness, healthcare, and performance professionals actionable steps to help people around the world first move well, then move often. One continuing education credit, or CEC, courtesy of Functional Movement Systems, will be emailed to all participants after the webinar. You should receive the CEC email and a link to the presentation within the next 1 to 2 days. There's no need to email ACSM asking about CEC credits. During this presentation, Dr. Lee Burton will provide insight into how to create a better foundation for individuals seeking to improve and enhance their shoulder and upper body function. He will discuss strategies that are designed to target areas often overlooked that, when addressed, will build a path for improved strength and durability. Dr. Burton has an extensive background in sports medicine and strength and conditioning. He currently consults with a wide variety of professional sports organizations, as well as leading health and fitness facilities on injury prevention and performance enhancement. He lectures both nationally and internationally on various topics in the fields of sports medicine and strength and conditioning. Dr. Burton is a certified athletic trainer, certified strength and conditioning specialist, and one of the founding owners of Functional Movement Systems. It is with great pleasure that we present to you Dr. Lee Burton.
Thank you, Katie. And I want to thank everyone for joining today. I really appreciate the opportunity. I want to really thank ACSM for giving me this opportunity as well to come and speak about shoulder strength and function. It's definitely a topic that anyone that is walking into the gym or thinking about beginning a fitness regime or regimen is considering. So it's certainly a topic that everyone has some opinions on. So hopefully I'll share some of mine today and some of the principles that we at FMS follow, and hopefully that you'll take away some of the tidbits today. So I really appreciate this opportunity. Just a little bit more about my background. Katie, I really appreciate that intro for me, but my background is athletic training, sports medicine. I started my career working at a high school as an athletic trainer, and then went to university setting as an athletic trainer in charge of the athletic training curriculum. And more recently, I've taken over pretty much the primary role of running our Functional Movement Systems, which is pretty much a seminar and a consulting business that we try to go out and try to talk more about, functional movement and how to get people moving a little bit better. And I think that's what we're all trying to do. But let's jump right in. We've got about, 45 minutes or so, hopefully get some questions answered and really talk about, what are we trying to accomplish with the shoulder? And I think too often people walk into the gym and just thinking about doing some overhead presses or doing some bench pressing, forward presses, whatever the case may be. And that's what they assume what they need to do to get their shoulder stronger and more functional. And for some people, that may be where they should start. That may be what they should be doing. And often many of us, me included, aren't sure where to start with a lot of these individuals that we're working with. If we're talking about the shoulder, we don't want to make too many assumptions. We have to figure out what the goal is for the individual. If it is to get more strength in their upper body, then there's certain things we need to consider potentially first before we even hand them a weight or before we prescribe an exercise. And that's really what I want to talk about today, is really thinking about not only how to strengthen and produce a more functional and durable shoulder, but give an overall view of what else we need to consider if we're talking about specifically the upper body training that most of us, again, want and need to do. But we need to consider movement and function and how movement and just functional movements and positions affect the shoulder and vice versa. How does things we do in the shoulder affect movement? But we need to think about just general movements are what we do every day. There's nothing specific. It's really how do we accomplish our daily activities? Are we active? And too often, many of us assume we've got to go in the gym to get in our exercise when a lot of times we can just increase our activity level. And if we increase our activity level, sometimes that takes care of a lot of the issues and a lot of the things that we want to have happen. But we really have to think about, things that we do in the shoulder every day, on the upper body every day. And a lot of times, again, we assume that it's about playing sports, or we assume about activities that we're going to do in the weight room or playing tennis or playing golf. And a lot of us, again, the clients and the people and athletes, even athletes that we train, use their shoulders in a variety of ways throughout the day. As we go through our daily activities, we're putting our shoulders and our upper body in a very stressful position. And we have to understand that based off what potentially the lower body is doing, our core and other things, how much stress does that place on the body? How much stress are we putting on the body throughout the day in our activities? And not just our activities, but our jobs. Does our job require us to get in certain positions that place our shoulders or upper bodies in a very vulnerable position? Are we putting a lot of stress on those areas of the body? That may dictate how we train the person. If the person is doing certain activities throughout the day that requires them to lift overhead or twist their bodies, that may also impact how we want to train them. So if I'm in a job, for example, or even an athlete that requires me to move a certain direction. So if I'm in a position or a job that requires me to move right throughout the day, well, during that job throughout the day, I'm moving right all day. That may require or create an asymmetry in the body. Well, that then leads me to understand maybe why I may be having some problems or what I need to do in the weight room or during my training to maybe offset some of those things I'm doing. If I'm an overhand athlete or a tennis player that's right side dominant, there's things I'm doing during my activity that certainly will impact how I'm moving without that activity, but also what I need to consider when prescribing some activities in the weight room and during training. So these are things we need to also look at when we're thinking about movement, just general movement and function. How does our general movement and function impact our shoulder? How does the lower body or lower body problems impact things we may need to do in the shoulders or an upper body? Or how many compensations that may need to lead us to do? We have to understand that what's happening in the upper body impacts the lower body and vice versa. If I'm requiring myself to get down, lower my center of gravity, whether it's a squat or a lunge, and do something, whatever that something is, pick up my kids, pick up some toys on the job, then how I can lower that center of gravity is directly affected by my ability to use my hips, my knees. But if my job requires it, or if I'm required to lower my center of gravity and my lower body doesn't move properly, then I'm going to have to use my upper body more. I'm going to have to sacrifice maybe some stability in my upper body, maybe have to use a little bit extra range of motion in my upper body to get down in that position because my lower body doesn't move. And those are things we've got to consider when we talk about just general movement and function, how all of this is affected. And certainly we start accelerating, or maybe a better word would be when we're trying to increase that activity level, we're trying to get into higher levels of activity like sports or athletics, running at a higher level, then certainly the shoulders and upper body are going to be impacted or will impact what's going on in the lower body. Because obviously when we're talking about ambulation, just simply walking, the upper body helps create that momentum. And when we start running, the upper body is going to help create some of that momentum. So we have to understand that we're not just talking about one area of the body. We're talking about how that one area of the body is impacted and impacts other areas of the body. And this concept is really not new. It's really a basic concept that's been around for years and years. I think Vladimir Yonder really spoke about this back, I'll say in the late 60s or mid-60s, talking about this idea of regional interdependence. And this idea about regional interdependence is really how, kind of what I just described when we talk about movement and function, how one particular joint or area of the body or region of the body is impacted by what's going on in other specific joints or areas of the body. So we're talking about the upper body, or specifically the shoulders today. Well, what's going on, or how the shoulder works and operates is going to be directly impacted on what's going on in the hand, what's going on in the cervical spine or neck, and what's going on in the thoracic spine. So that's the idea of regional interdependence, but we can take it a step further, because if we really think about movement, if I've got a problem in the lower body, I got a problem in my ankle as an example, or even my big toe, my that first metatarsal phalangeal joint, which people kind of forget until it becomes a problem. Even something is kind of smaller areas that can impact what's going on in my upper extremities. If I don't have good ankle mobility, I may have to reach a little bit further out to get that glass of water, or reach a little further out to get those keys if I'm standing. So we have to understand that everything is impacted by certain other areas of the body. And that's that idea of regional interdependence. And if you look here at this image, you notice that every other area of the body is impacted by the other with this mobile stable. So if we look at, generally speaking, certain joints or certain areas have a tendency or should be more mobile or more stable. So if we look at the foot as an example, the foot should be a little bit more stable and the ankle should be more mobile. And as we go up the kinetic chain, the knee should be more stable, the hip should be more mobile. The lumbopelvic area should be more stable, allowing the thoracic spine to be a little bit more mobile. So the T-spine should be mobile. The scapula should be more stable. The shoulder, we know, is a very mobile joint. So we know every other joint in our kinetic chain should play off that mobile, stable idea, or really not idea or concept. And that's really how we're set up to move and function properly. The problem is, as many of you know, with our tendency to sit, technology allowing us to not move as well or move as often, we have a tendency to to have problems and not have that mobile, stable as it's supposed to be, that opposite all the way up through the kinetic chain. So many times if I have a stiff hip, that's just going to force me to use too much lumbopelvic motion. So my stiff hip will actually create or force me to be more unstable in my low back. My stiff hip may force me to be a little bit more unstable in my knee. So those are the types of things that occur because the body is simply trying to overcome those areas of dysfunction or weakness or tightness. So in the shoulders, for example, if the shoulder's not moving or is not as stable as it needs to be, then we're going to have other areas of the body sacrificed. A lot of times we talk about scapular stabilization. We're working on scapular stabilization. Well, the scapula may be unstable because the thoracic spine doesn't move like it should. So this concept that we're talking about directly impacts our movement, our function. And it really is built that way. And I think that's the problem that a lot of us don't understand is we're like, okay, that happens, but that's what's supposed to happen if we're trying to we're always going to sacrifice that quality for quantity. We are always going to try to accomplish a task. So I go back to picking up something off the floor, picking up this bottle of water. Those things are things that our brain is telling us to do. It doesn't matter if I've got a weakness or tightness in the body. We're always going to try to overcome that by accomplishing the task. So that's really the problem. But as long as we know that's the problem, it gives us the opportunity to work through that problem, knowing that no matter what we do in our daily activities, we're always trying to accomplish the task, and we may have to sacrifice this quality to get that. The problem really is if we don't understand that and don't attack that sooner rather than later, it could create bigger problems. So if the thoracic spine is not moving well, causing me to create scapular instabilities, causing me to create problems in the shoulder, then over time that shoulder is moving inefficiently. And over time that inefficiency in the shoulder may create shoulder problems, may create some impingement that we'll talk about in a few minutes. So the problems that typically the underlying problems that we may see, like a hip that's not moving, like a thoracic spine that's not moving, which, as we know, most of those are common problems in today's society, then that's simply going to lead to our inability to stabilize properly in the lumbopelvic area. It's going to limit our ability to stabilize properly in the upper body. And those things need to happen when we bend over to pick something up or when we reach our hands above our heads. We need to have efficient movements throughout our system in order to move and function properly. And if we don't, well, let's first identify it and let's try to fix it. But understand that if we don't identify it and don't fix it, those underlying issues may lead to pain or some other problems down the road. And we certainly don't want to train a person who has these dysfunctions. That's the other key component here that we want to talk about, is if I've got some limitations somewhere in the body, I need to identify those and not just work around them. Because a person who has thoracic spine mobility problems is certainly not going to be doing an overhead press properly. Even though they can get that arm above the head and they can get that weight above their head, they're going to do it with the lack of integrity. So we always need to make sure in our profession that we focus on that quality of that movement first, and then we can add load to it as we move on. So the real question is, where do we start this? Where do we start our process? If our goal is to first make sure someone is functioning properly, then we can move into strength and durability and making sure we put them on the right path. And I think really the goal is to find out where the biggest opportunity is. So when we think about this, we're trying to find these areas of dysfunction, but if we look at it a little bit differently, if we find this area of dysfunction, well, that's an opportunity. We know this person that we're working on and we want to work on, this athlete or this client that we're working on, try to help out. We know most people have some dysfunctions, whether it be because of their habits, whether it be because of a previous injury. Well, if we can find that, we can identify it, we can then try to give them some things to improve it. And then that's the biggest part of the success we want to look at. That's the biggest opportunity. It could be related to sleep. It could be related to a lot of other things, but we just want to simply find out, where's that rock in the shoe? Is there a rock in the shoe? If they're running, if there is, remove the rock. So finding the biggest issue and attacking it is going to give you the biggest impact and have you the most success early on. And I think that's a very important thing for all of us to realize. We want to get everyone stronger. We want everyone to live a longer, healthier life. So let's look as soon as possible to find the one thing that we can focus on that will make the biggest impact as early as we can. And if we're not making an impact, let's know that and try to make that big impact. But the first thing is to figure out where that impact can be and where that opportunity lies. And again, if the person's got a painful back, we need to figure that out. If a person just has dysfunctional movements and doesn't move very well, we need to understand that. If a person moves well, but they don't have any pain, but you know what? They just need to get more fit. They need to get stronger. I want to know that. If that's my biggest area I want to focus on, great. But I don't want to sacrifice the fundamentals to do that. So I need to make sure we got the fundamentals taken care of. Because if a person doesn't move very well initially, well, the first thing we have to do, and the assumption is too often, is we need to correct that area. Well, the first thing we have to need to do when we're talking about creating a good workout is to protect that area. I don't want to take a person who's got some dysfunctions in their shoulder and have them do overhead presses. So the first thing I need to do is think about, what are the things I can do to remove some of the issues that may be causing your problems in your upper back and your shoulders. Now, the elephant in the room right now, if we're talking about the upper body, is sitting too much, sitting with poor posture. Are there things we can do that will impact them? That it's not just about what we're doing in the weight room and removing an exercise. Let's think about things that they may be doing in their daily activities that may be leading to some of these problems. And again, protect, remove before we think about correcting. Because if a person's got poor form just with their body weight, loading those activities will only make it worse. So protection is the first order and thing that we need to consider. What are the exercises that will not help this individual, that could potentially hurt this individual? And that's first and foremost. But we have to take it a step further. What are also the things that this person may be doing in their daily lives that may be leading to some of these problems or dysfunctions in their fundamental movements? We can identify and have that conversation. We can have a potential impact on that as well. And that's really the ultimate goal is, again, it's about overall health and fitness, not just about strength training the shoulder. So what we do, obviously, with FMS is we'll do a fundamental movement screen. And this movement screen, first and foremost, and you see the word health here, it's to make sure the person moves healthy. Now, moving healthy means, can you move without pain? Because if you've got problems with some of these basic fundamental movements and it hurts, maybe it hurts your knee, maybe it hurts your shoulder when you do some of these basic activities, well, that right there tells me we need to do something to address it. I need to do some type of intervention. Obviously, it tells me we can't train you in those areas of pain, but pain tells us anytime there's pain with movement, there's also going to be disruptions in your motor, your neuromuscular system. You're going to have proprioceptive awareness problems. Your muscles aren't going to fire when they need to. You're not going to stabilize when you need to. Again, compensations will occur. And the problem is, it doesn't matter really where the pain is. If the pain's on board, your body's going to create some inefficiencies. So pain is really that red blinking light. And that's why we say health, because pain is a healthcare problem that we have to address. And then we look at function. If you don't have any pain, let's make sure you can at least function properly. And it's not that you've got to do an overhead squat perfect. It's just minimally. What is the minimum barrier we want to see you do? And it's basically get into the position. Even if you can do the movements, that's okay. But I just don't want to see you not be able to do some of these things at all, even just the low-level body weight movements, because that tells me you've got a potential dysfunction that we need to address. But more importantly, we need to avoid certain things. So if we, realize that you don't have any, we've identified pain that's a potential problem, or you walk in with pain, we need to identify the cause and treat it. So with us, we do another type of movement assessment, but we look and try to identify the underlying cause of the pain. Just because you have back pain doesn't mean your back is the problem. Back pain tells me, okay, your back hurts, we have to treat it, but I need to find out, is there something else causing your back pain? And that's important because, again, that tells me what we need to do related either to training or some type of medical intervention. But let's say you don't have any pain, you're moving pretty well. Well, then we need to set a baseline on where you are as far as your fitness is, and that's strength, power, and endurance, and then develop that. Again, the strategy is the same. I want to figure out where's the best opportunity. And if I take you through what we deem as our fundamental capacity screen, and I identify you got problems in higher level motor controls, you got problems in posture control, maybe power, then again, that's still my opportunity to improve that. So I'm still taking our same philosophy, even if you don't have any pain and you move pretty well, to say, okay, those are great. Now let's find out where the opportunity is related to your strength, your power, your endurance. Those are the things still we need to focus on. Because again, we're still trying to figure out and pinpoint that area of focus with our program. Because if you got pain, we need to get healthy first. If you don't move very well, we need to get functional. I got to get you moving right. And if you don't have good fitness, we got to get you fit. But if you do all those right, let's get after it. Let's go after it. And I think that's kind of our underlying philosophy, is just simply trying to figure out where you need to go and how I can put you on that path as a fitness strength coach professional. So we're going to apply that underlying thinking to the upper body. And really, if you think about it, if we talk about upper body, really most strength conditioning moves, we're simply really talking about pushing and pressing. And then we can get into all different types of variations. But pushing and pressing, whether you do it horizontal or vertical, those are the two primary things we're going to be doing if we're talking about the upper body. Now, once we talk about that, we can go into all kinds of variations, whether it's one arm, two arms, whether it's, whether you're doing like a push-up, whether you're doing half kneeling, tall kneeling, standing on one foot, all different variations. But again, the first thing we have to do is make sure the person is healthy. Are they ready to engage and do this? And I think sometimes people make assumptions. But still, let's have that conversation. Let's do the basics. Let's make sure that we're focusing in on the right thing. It may be they're not sleeping very well. Maybe what's their injury history like? Did they have a previous shoulder problem that I need to be aware of? Have they had shoulder surgeries that I need to be aware of? All of these are things that we need to consider before we just arbitrarily move on and start prescribing certain activities. And for that matter, before I even start doing some type of fundamental movement screen. Because if I'm doing a movement screen and I'm putting them in certain positions and they had a history of subluxations in the shoulders, there may be certain activities I may want to avoid even during the screening process before I feel comfortable doing some of those things. So these things are very important before we even get into actually specifically talking about training any part of the body. But let's consider the upper body first. And most all of us know the shoulder is a very, very mobile joint, and it's designed to be that way. Not stable, but we got to have some stability. So we know we got these big, powerful prime movers around the shoulder that are designed to create strength, create power, and do these things that we want to do in our activities, daily activities, where it be daily activities or upper level activities. And then obviously the big thing that most people talk about when we talk about the shoulder, as far as a lot of times training the shoulder or rehabbing the shoulder, is the rotator cuff. Now the rotator cuff, as we all know, and you look in most textbooks that talk about the anatomy and the kinesiology, the rotator cuff is primarily there to create some stability. And if you dive deeper, parts of the rotator cuff internally and externally rotate the shoulder. But let's think about how it functions. And really, if we think about how it functions, yes, it's there to create stability, but it's there to create good joint positioning. And take it a step further. you don't necessarily want to train the rotator cuff by doing internal external rotation. You want to make the rotator cuff respond and react because it's a stability muscle. It wants to place the shoulder in a good position, so then those big prime movers like the pecs, the deltoids, the biceps, the lats, all those bigger muscles can create good leverage, can pull on a very stable joint. So that's what the rotator cuff is really designed to do. And it's there designed to be reactive. So my brain says, if I'm going to throw, if I'm going to pull, if I'm going to push, before my arm even moves, my rotator cuff has to turn on, put the joint in a good position so those other big muscles can do their job. And I think that's how we need to look at the shoulder, because that's going to be important as we start talking about training the shoulder properly. But the common problems we see in the shoulder, again, if you go back to some of that regional interdependence I described, you know that if we have problems in a thoracic spine mobility, then we may be addressing, or may be resulting in certain inflammation of the shoulder. Two most common issues are going to be something called impingement or rotator cuff tendonitis. And impingement, again, the bursa is there to help create a little bit of spacing and allow so you don't start really irritating the rotator cuff. But if the shoulder's not moving the way it needs to do, if you've got some inefficiency in your movement, if that scapula, if you think about this, the scapula is not moving and getting out of the way when you get to that 30 degrees of shoulder flexion, that scapula is supposed to kind of move and get out of the way, and you don't have good posture, then the first thing that's going to happen is that head of the humerus is going to start rubbing on that bursa, and that's going to cause some inflammation. And that's really the body's first telltale sign to tell you something's wrong, we need to do something. You got to address this, or it's going to lead to a bigger problem. And that bigger problem over time could be a rotator cuff tear, which, again, you could start getting at 45, 50, 60 years, 55 years old. Most people that have had a lot of history of impingement, rotator cuff tendonitis, that's where you can trace it back to that rotator cuff tear. So we have to consider that. Catch it early, address it early is really the key. But we can't forget about the cervical spine, because a lot of people who have shoulder problems, let's go back and look at the cervical spine. If you got a cervical spine problem, we may need to, or excuse me, if you have a shoulder problem, you may want to look at the cervical spine. And you could do some simple range of motions to see if any of those range of motions are limited, again, or cause pain. If you've got problems with the cervical spine, many times it will lead to issues in the shoulder. So again, just for a lot of trainers, fitness professionals, you find a problem in the shoulder, maybe if you can, do some basic range of motions. And if you find something, get them out to a physical therapist, chiropractor, somebody that can do a good evaluation of that cervical spine to make sure that's not creating an underlying problem. And then, of course, I've mentioned this quite a bit. We have our thoracic mobility issues. Thoracic mobility many times could be or is the cause of shoulder dysfunction. If the shoulder's not working right, we have to address the thoracic spine. Because the thoracic spine is what is going to give the shoulder a good foundation to move and function properly. So if we've got these people that walk in, forward head posture, a little bit of kyphosis, is it actually a kyphosis or is it just posture, or, what is it? And let's make sure that we can address that issue. And also the thing you need to also consider is breathing. Because one, if you've got this forward head lean, you've got this kyphotic posture, your breathing is going to be impacted. And the one thing that has been shown with some of the research and data that's been shown out there is the fact that movement and breathing are related. So if you've got a breathing problem, good chance you can have a movement problem. If you have a movement problem, good chance you can have a breathing problem. So these things are interconnected. Now, it's the chicken or the egg. Which one comes first? You could argue that breathing causes movement problems. You could argue that movement causes problems called breathing problems. But again, making sure the person moves correctly. And there's different things you can check. There's a breathing screen you can perform to kind of set that baseline. So there's different things you can do to check breathing. But again, if the person has a shoulder dysfunction, check their breathing, or at least give them some activities to do, because chances are a person who's got significant shoulder issues will have some breathing dysfunction as well. So there's just things to consider, and I'll talk about those here in a minute. But the upper body is, again, we can't think of it. If we go back to this regional interdependence concept, that we realize that the shoulder's not acting alone. It's going to affect the entire body. And we have to look at it as more of an upper quarter thing as a just lower body or upper body idea. So we have to consider everything. Because if we talk specifically about the thoracic spine, there's a lot of different movements that are going on. The thoracic spine doesn't spin like a top. You actually get a little bit of flexion, a little bit of extension, And when you talk about all those different T-spine, thoracic spine, all those different facets, all those different things, that spine is moving with a little bit of flexion, a little bit of extension, and that's what creates our rotation. There's a lot of things going on, and the less of that flexion extension you get, the more torque you could place on certain parts of the body. But then we have to consider also stability. And we can't just make assumptions. Again, we have to put the people in a functional position, and that's where our fundamental movements come in. And then how do those fundamental dysfunctions actually impact our more fundamental movements? So when we look at our movement screen, we break it down to primarily 3 different foot positions. And the upper body will impact the 3 different foot positions. So you may do great in squatting, but have a problem in the lunge position. And as you see, it requires a good amount of mobility in all 3 of these patterns in order for you to perform them properly. So the shoulder impacts these, but certainly these limitations here could impact the shoulder. So we have to understand that. And then the other thing that we've seen is the fact that limitations in your mobility in the upper body impact your grip. And I showed that on an earlier slide. Your grip is impacted quite a bit by what's going on in your upper body, and vice versa. If you got poor grip, it may be an upper body problem. So I'm not saying that improving your grip is going to give you great upper body function, but it's just a way to gauge what's going on in your system, because there's a lot of research and a lot of data on grip strength and how it influences health and wellness. So it's just something to consider and something to look at. And actually, we've seen it, a relationship between a lack of ankle mobility and grip as well, and some of the data that we've collected over the years. So we know that mobility is something we have to consider. We're talking about the upper body, but just also maybe use that grip as a gauge of how else some things may be impacted. So when we talk about where to start, you look at how we lay out our FMS, or our functional movement screen. Those 3 different foot positions over here at the top, those are very complex movements. But we look at the next 3, if we go from right to left, you see those are more specific areas. Now we're talking more regionally in how stability is impacted. But if we look at specifically the shoulder, how shoulder mobility, we need to first look at shoulder mobility and then see how we stabilize it, and then let's put it in functional positions. And if we go back to our neurodevelopmental sequencing, how all of us learn to move, that's how we started. We need to make sure, as babies going through those first 18 months before we started ambulating and walking and doing all the cool things that we do as humans, we had great mobility. And then we learned to stabilize it. And that's how we lay out some of these fundamental movements. Let's make sure we got good mobility in a more of a functional way. Okay, then let's look at stability in certain ways. So when we look at our shoulder test, it's a real simple shoulder test. Put your feet together, see how close you can get your fist on your back. And again, this is not just the shoulder. This is looking at your upper back. This is actually looking at your posture. This is looking at, kind of like I said, that upper quarter. And by having both arms move simultaneously, we are creating some torque in the thoracic spine. So this simple little motion checks the box on a lot of different things. So if we're good here, we feel pretty confident we got good mobility. Well, now let's look at it in more of a stability position. Let's look at a quadruped motion. So here we're looking at that same side, but you could do a quadruped, more of a diagonal, more traditional crawling pattern, and just check to see if a person can stabilize in this position. Because we're not forcing you in a very high level stability position, more lower level. So let's start a little bit more lower level, and let's progress to a more high level activity and see, can you perform a push-up correctly? And again, we're looking at a push-up as a total body activity, but it certainly has an impact on what's going on in the shoulder. If a person's got some stability issues, certainly it's going to be uncovered in this position. However, it could be uncovered in this position as well if there's a stability problem, if they have an inability to kind of post on that one side. Here's much more stress being placed on the shoulder. So again, if you have a history of shoulder problems, you got a history of subluxation, you may not want to have a person do a floor push-up. You may want to go from the wall as an example, just to see if they can create that stability. Now, the other reason we do the push-up here is not just about the upper body, but to also determine and check to see if they got stability in the core. So we're looking to see, by doing this horizontal push, can we prevent hyperextension in the spine? So there's a lot of things going on in these basic, very simple movements. And then, of course, finally, how do those things impact our fundamental functional movements? Symmetrical base or squat, single leg stance, split stance. Because if you've got limitations in your shoulder, are these impacted? And if we set a baseline, does it impact these things as well? So we score these 0 to 3. We make it simple. 0's cause pain. 1 means you can't do it. We're really looking for zeros and ones. Can you not do the movement at all? Is really kind of that thing that we look for to say, 1, we need to protect you. 2, we need to give you something to improvement. If there's a 0, well, then that tells us, you know what, probably shouldn't be doing much in that area, or we need to get that area evaluated. And what we found is the more 2s and 3s you have, and this is some data that we've seen over the years, and actually some of it has been published, and you can find it on our website if you search under research, is that the quicker, the better you move, the quicker you return back after an injury. So I'm not saying you're going to get less injuries with the 2s or 3s, but if you do get injured and you're moving well going into that injury, you'll get back a little bit quicker. So dysfunctional movement, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for those ones. We're looking for those major problems. And that's kind of what give you a snapshot of what that looks like and why it's important to not have someone do certain activities because they're dysfunctional. So if we look at that snapshot, again, just pull out those areas, the squat, the lunge, the shoulder. We need to avoid loading those areas. Doesn't mean they can't work out. We just don't want to load them in those specific areas. The leg raise, the lower body looks pretty good, so potentially we could do that. Now, the question becomes, what do we focus on first? So if we look at protecting those areas and avoiding those certain areas, how do we get those areas better? And if we think about looking back at this motion, well, the squat's bad, the lunge is bad. How do we improve those? Well, if we understand that the shoulder directly impacts the lunge and the squat, let's zero in, improve shoulder mobility, and then go back to see, does improving shoulder mobility actually impact the squat and the lunge? And many times it will. So again, the squat is very complicated. The lunge is very complicated. So let's go ahead and zero in on an area, improve that, and then go back and check to see if those other areas are improved as well. Because if we're really putting together a corrective strategy on the upper body and the shoulder, well, let's look at packages. Let's put you in different positions where we can stress your shoulder and your posture. So we're not just worried, we're looking at one area. We're putting in this whole idea between regional and interdependence to work in the corrective program as well. So again, I mentioned breathing. If you've got a shoulder problem, let's make sure we look at breathing as a focus. So I've got 2 exercises right here that are real basic, but they look like they're pretty difficult. There's different ways to actually help you get into positions. You can use a pillow under the knee, on the top knee. As you see, what we got Kyle doing in the top left video, he's focused on the thoracic spine. So the one thing I'll say, if you have a shoulder problem, before you go start really trying to, if it's a shoulder limited motion, before you start trying to just go stretch the shoulder out, just do some basic breathing activities, do some basic thoracic mobility activities, and then go back and check. I can't stress that enough. Just go back and check to see. Many times, just some basic breathing, some basic thoracic mobility activities will automatically put the shoulder in a better position to function and create better mobility, create better stability, by simply doing that. And what you'll see, supported spine position, well, that takes us back to the whole idea about neurodevelopmental sequencing. We started moving by having on the ground, on our backs, rolling around on the floor. Well, let's go back to that. Let's use that to our advantage. Let's focus on some breathing. So when I say focus on breathing, in this example, you just want to cycle your breaths. So take a breath in, and as you go into rotation, exhale the breath and let the breath go out. And you want to get to that end point and maybe take another breath in and let it go out as you rotate. So we got 2 different versions here of that focusing in on thoracic spine. One's kind of combining it with a little bit of lower body. The other's just primarily focusing in on that thoracic range of motion. So again, if we think about neurodevelopmental sequencing, we go from a supported spine position to a suspended spine position. So again, coupling these and creating a little package of exercises are what we want to do if the person's got limitations. If the person's moving great, we're going to go right into some other level of activities. But if they've got some limitations, which again, a lot of people do, let's zero in and focus on some of these basic things first. So we go into our supported position, focus on thoracic mobility. Well, we're focused on mobility because we're in supported position. Well, now by suspending your spine, you're combining both mobility and motor control or stability into the same activity. So you see in that top left video, Kyle's actually posting on that one side as he goes into some rotation. So again, if we think about how the thoracic spine moves, we have that flexion and extension, or we really have a push and a pull. So if we talk about pushing of driving that left hand down as I rotate, well, that's going to actually give us a little bit better opportunity for fundamental movement. Again, combining our mobility and motor control. That's how we move correctly, is both that yin and yang of mobility and motor control. We always have to play off those two. Now, we focus on mobility first just by what we're trying to accomplish. So our mobility just goes back to the neurodevelopmental sequence, but we quickly got to add some stability to it. And here's some simple variations of trying to improve that mobility. And then the bottom video you'll see, just to kind of talk about that for a second, is you notice that Kyle has himself kind of pushed back, and that just simply isolates out the upper back a little bit more. We have more of a, I would say, total spine position in the top left video. The bottom left, same exercise, we're just pushing him back and focusing a little bit more on the upper back. So we go from suspended spine position, which is our crawling, if you think about going back to what babies do, to our stacked or loaded spine position. So now we have different stacked or loaded positions. We can do the same thing. Again, now we got a little bit of mobility. Let's add some stability into it. So we can do what's called a halo, or we can do a tall kneeling turn. Either one of these are good variations. It kind of depends on, what you're trying to accomplish. As an example, this is where I would look back at the movement screen and say, hey, you've got a lunge pattern problem. You've also got a shoulder pattern problem. Let's get you in that half kneeling position and work through the pattern in that position, because again, that's my opportunity. That's your area of dysfunction. Let's zero in on that versus a squat pattern problem. And then ultimately we get to standing. And in standing, we're just going to go through a real basic toe touch. We're going to use one arm up, go down, and we're just going to touch your toes. And just by having it in this toe up position, that's just forcing a better hip hinge, forcing you to utilize correct movement a little bit better. So then we alternate the arms down at the top just to give you that a little bit more of awareness and control of what we're trying to do. So now we're utilizing your entire body in more of a functional position, but still isolating the upper body a little bit more. So again, think about postural control as we go through this process. And some of those things, again, going from that supported all the way up to standing, we go through that. But once we get our mobility, we have to put it together in a more stable position. But we have to understand that we can't just assume these are working. We've got to go back and rescreen. Just identify the area of difficulty and make sure that the things we prescribe actually give us the results and outcomes we want. And that takes us back to just rescreening to make sure that we have the right exercise. If you rescreen and check the pattern of dysfunction, they didn't get any better, well, then simply choose a different exercise or different technique. That's okay. Again, you're trying to figure out what's going to give you the best outcome. And then get into development. We got a couple of Indian clubs are great. Carries, farmers carries are great. These are all great activities. They're a little bit different than most of the traditional pushing and pressing, but they give you some great upper body. The swings and the slams are great activities for the upper body. You can get a little bit of cardio in there. The carries are great for posture control. And then we get into pushes and presses and pulls. Again, a lot of different variations. Consider the stance. So again, don't just have the person standing upright or sitting down. Do it tall kneeling. Do it half kneeling. Again, utilize what you know they may have problems or difficulty in and put them in that position. If they've got some problems with a squat pattern problem, then put them in that. But go ahead and have them go down into a tall kneeling position. Do a half kneeling position. Start with one arm and progress to two arms. One arm is going to force a little bit of a stability bias. It's going to force you to make sure you maintain good posture control. Then go to standing. Do the same thing. Use that stance position a little bit differently. Do kettlebells with bottoms up. These are, again, different things you can do. Try out different variations, focusing in on the upper body. With the kettlebells, upper body, lower the weight down. Start with one arm. Obviously, you need to protect the person. Lower that weight down, but that bottoms up kettlebell really forces better shoulder positioning, forces better posture control than doing it just for pure strength gains. Single versus double arm. Again, single arm is going to be a little bit more create a little bit more instability in the body. So just think about that. If you know you've got an individual that is a little bit more unstable, just generally speaking, it could be an athlete that hey, we got to work on some stability. So instead of going to two arms, focus on one arm activity. That one arm activity, that off-center load is going to force you to create better stability, better postural control as you go up into the press or pull or whatever the case may be. So those are just some different activities, different things to consider as we go into the development phase. But we got to make sure we got that good foundation first. And again, just some basic considerations to think about, not just training the upper body, but training the overall body. We got to first make sure we've got a good foundation. And if we don't have a good foundation, what are certain exercises that aren't going to help, and remove those? I think too often we get into a mindset that we want to focus on corrective exercise, but really corrective exercise is dependent upon removing the thing that causes the dysfunction. So let's make sure that we're not causing more problems by having the person do an exercise that they're not ready to do. The whole point about looking at fundamental movements is figuring out what the person can and can't do and start from there. One of the biggest things, one of the biggest takeaways is find that big opportunity. And that big opportunity sometimes is to give them some advice about what they're doing in their daily activities. Sometimes that big opportunity may be focusing on something that may not be involved with training. It could be involved with something they're doing on their own. Some of their behaviors, maybe they may not be sleeping correctly or enough. They may not be breathing the way they should. We can check their breathing. So all these things are what we got to consider, but you're trying to really find that opportunity that you can focus on and then build on it. But don't hesitate to go back and recheck to make sure that what you're prescribing is working. I don't think we do that enough. Let's make sure if I fail, if I'm not getting the success I want, then I want to know that as soon as possible, because you're not wasting your time or their time. Giving them another activity is better than thinking the activity is working. So I really, really appreciate the opportunity to come in today to speak to you guys. We've got a lot of resources online. A lot of the exercises you saw here, you can go to our website and look at our exercise library. Some of them are on there. A lot of them are actually on there. A few are not. But yeah, check that out. We have a lot of other articles, resources that are certainly open and free to you guys to go check out. I really appreciate it. And I think now we're going to take some questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Burton. That was really interesting. And we have almost as many comments complimenting the presentation as we do questions. So I'll remind all the participants that if they'd like to ask more questions, they can type them into the questions box. And we'll start with one. What is your go-to exercise or stretch for shoulder health for any client, and why?
I will circle back. I don't know if I can go back to pull up my slide, but yeah, I would say if the person getting this sideline position, I really think this one, I don't know if they can see it, but it's really just a sideline, and it's really more thoracic spine. I think most problems in the shoulder are a result of a thoracic spine mobility issue. So I think if you start by focusing on thoracic spine and just doing a basic sideline rotation like you see here, then that's going to solve most of the problems. Again, I'm not going to say, well, I will. I'll say, well, I'll take a gamble. I'll say a lot of the problems that we see. So I think this would be the go-to if I had to pinpoint one. If I had a shoulder problem, mobility specifically, I would go to this first.
Great. Here's another one. What is the association between grip strength and rotator cuff strength?
Yeah, I think I will give you my opinion. I can't say that I can pull out the research or data right now. I'm thinking there is data saying that rotator cuff strength and grip strength are related. I do know that shoulder mobility and grip strength are related. And the one thing I'll say is if you have an instability in the shoulder, which is where you're going to get that rotator cuff strength, if your shoulder is unstable or in a vulnerable position, that's your brain saying you're not going to grip very hard. Because again, your grip is going to be anticipating you lifting up an object. And if your shoulder is unstable, your grip is not going to want to lift up a heavy object. So I'll use a farmer's carry. So if my shoulder is kind of out of place or not in a good place, my grip will give out first because my shoulder is unstable. Now, it's not my grip. It's actually my shoulder is the problem. So I'd probably relate that back to the rotator cuff weakness as well.
Great. There are a couple of questions related to a special population, the older adults. And
Yep.
One of the questions is, how do you apply the FMS screening to older adult populations who maybe are not able to perform a lot of the movements or screenings?
Yeah, I think the idea would be, and I'll come and go back up there. We certainly understand there's going to be limitation. We certainly don't expect a lot of individuals to be able to do these moves. And I'll preface it by saying I don't want to make too many assumptions just because they're older populations. There are a lot of older individuals that you guys train that move really, really well, and they're running marathons, they're doing all kinds of stuff. So I think you've got to be the judge initially to say this isn't going to be right, or this potentially could be right for these individuals. We do have a modified version, and we are we're actually in development of a couple other things that I think will help. But to specifically answer your question, if you're looking at our 7 test right here, the leg raise, I think you could get them on a bed and have them on a mat table and have them do the leg raise pretty easily, and just see if they can get that ankle past their knee. Shoulder mobility is pretty easy as well. Obviously, the 2 stability tests, maybe you may not want to put them in those crawling or push-up positions, but I think single leg stance is certainly something I would have the person do. So between single leg stance, looking at shoulder and hip mobility, I would also argue ankle mobility is something else that you probably need to check out. Those are things that I think anyone could do no matter the age. And again, you're just trying to set a baseline. That would be my recommendation, or my doing this for as long as I've done it. Just set the baseline and then see if you can improve it. In some of these older individuals, it may not be that you're trying to make huge improvements. It may be you're simply trying to not let it get worse. So if I'm looking at someone's shoulder mobility and I'm working with a 70-year-old and they've got really, really bad shoulder mobility, which, okay, I kind of knew when I saw them walk in, right? I'm just going to say, hey, here's where you are. We're going to give you some shoulder mobility, and we're going to make sure and check it periodically, see if it doesn't get better, fine, but let's not let it get worse.
Great. You touched on this a little bit in your presentation, but there are a couple of related questions that have come in surrounding how often should you retest or revisit the screenings?
If you find a significant problem or dysfunction, we recommend just doing that screen or test, whatever test that is, right? Just do it after the session. Do it at the end of the session. Do it after they do the exercise. Don't feel like you've got to sit there and take, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever time it takes you to perform some of these things. Just say, hey, let's check your shoulders out again. Let's see what you got. And you'll be very surprised how impactful 1 or 2 exercises can be. Now, let's say that. Now, let's also understand that they may come back the next session and lose that. But at least you know the recipe to get it, and at least you can prescribe them something at home to try to maintain it. So that's the idea, is to say, let's try a couple things and let's see what impact it makes. And I think that will be the thing. And now, in saying that, you make a great impact. They're moving better. They come back the next session. You check it again, and it's better. Then maybe check some of those other patterns. So if I've got a poor shoulder pattern, I've got a poor lunge pattern, I'm going to work the shoulder, and the shoulder's better. Then I'm going to go back and see if the lunge got better as well. And to be honest, many times you can improve shoulder mobility and improve their single leg stance. So a lot of you all that may work with older adults, those two a lot of times are related. And improving shoulder mobility could certainly carry over and improving their stance.
Great. Another question is, if we detect an upper crossed syndrome and thoracic stiffness, do we have to eliminate all overhead movements until the problem is fixed? Good question.
I would say it really depends. I hate to say it depends. I really do. Well, I won't say. I'll say it depends on. You've got to be the best. You got to be the judge of that. However, I would say if they really have poor upper body mobility and they really have poor posture, I'm going to say yes, but I'm not going to say they can't do upper body activities. I would then go right to the push-up and say, if they can do push-ups, if they can do forward presses, I'd have them do half kneelings or even standing forward horizontal presses as opposed to overhead presses. So they feel like they're getting some upper body work, but until I get them in a good posture and get their upper body looking a little bit better as far as mobility, and again, it's more about posture than anything. When I feel confident that they can go overhead with some load, then I would take them to that position. But one thing you consider, depending on, again, the individual, start them with some like a Turkish get-up or something like that, where actually you start them lying, and by the time, even if you do a half get-up, they got their arm above their head and they're working their posture from that position. So in essence, it's working your body under your arm. That's a great way to progress to overhead activities. So you don't need to start there, but you can get there. So start, if you've got to do some strength training, forward presses, maybe one arm is a little bit better. And then maybe start with some get-ups where you actually work yourself under your arm. That way you can progress to upper body training.
Great. Here's another one. What are your thoughts on improving thoracic mobility and that leading to increased scapular winging? Is that just SA weakness not compensating for new T-spine mobility?
All right, repeat that one, because I got thoracic mobility. All right, yeah, repeat that one from Katie.
Sure. What are your thoughts on improving thoracic mobility and that leading to increased scapular winging? Is that just SA A weakness not compensating for new T-spine mobility?
Yeah, it could. Yeah, I mean, okay, so yes, I'm focused on thoracic spine because that's typically a lot of the issues. But let's look at, so if let's say the shoulder moves well, or the upper, let's say thoracic spine is not a problem, but their scapula, I would look at our stability test, look at rotary stability, even in that quadruped position, is it winging out? In the push-up, do I notice winging? Those are the areas where I would look to see if there's some winging in the scapula, and if there is, then certainly I would address it by doing some type of scapular stability activity. But I would first make sure there's no thoracic mobility problems, because if they got thoracic mobility problems, that scapula has become a little bit more unstable to account for the thoracic mobility problem.
Sure. You mentioned earlier that the overall role of the rotator cuff was to stabilize the joint. Should you focus on strengthening the muscle specifically in order to protect the shoulder?
Yeah, I think there's, and again, this could be just semantics on how we talk about strengthening and stability. Because the rotator cuff is a stability muscle, it's designed to create stability in the shoulder. It's difficult to isolate and strength train it. So I would do more stability type training. Now in rehab, if I've got a shoulder problem, I may do some internal, external rotations, more for blood flow, to be honest, more to help get the shoulder moving a little bit better, create some blood flow, kind of activate the rotator cuff, if you will. But if I'm really trying to train the rotator cuff, I think you're better off focusing on more stability activities like a carry, like a deadlift, like a pull-up. Those things, they're very simple, but those are going to create distraction. Those are going to force almost to a quote unquote dislocation, because a pull-up is going to leave you in that hang position. So the first thing it's got to do is your rotator cuff's got to activate and create stability. Same thing with a carry or an overhead carry, a sidearm farmer's carry, an overhead carry. Those things are going to force your rotator cuff to work. And I mentioned deadlift. Deadlifts are great for rotator cuff because, again, you don't have to do a heavy deadlift. You can do a single arm RDL and really work the shoulder. So I think that will be more of the idea, to create stability and create reflex stabilization.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Burton. The questions just keep coming in, so we could keep you and everyone here all day, and we won't do that. So we'll have to wrap it up. I would note that we will, as mentioned before, record all the questions and look to focus a blog post on this, eventually answering the questions. Again, thanks to everyone for attending.